Chapter 13, Central Nervous System. The brain is composed of four parts: cerebrum, two hemispheres separated by a deep indentation known as the longitudinal fissure. Diencephalon consists of three parts, as does the brainstem, and finally the cerebellum, which is separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure. Superior view of the two hemispheres shows the separating longitudinal fissure. Two other terms here would be a sulcus is a shallow indentation, a gyrus is a bump. Looking at the coverings of the brain or meninges, from outside in, those are the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. The dura mater has two parts, periosteal and meningeal. In most areas, the two are fused. However, where they do separate, they form fluid-filled spaces known as sinuses. Effectively, these are veins. The largest is the superior sagittal sinus. Deep to the dura mater is a potential space, the subdural space. Deep to the arachnoid would be the CSF-filled subarachnoid space. Here you could also see an extension of the meningeal dura, which is known as the falx cerebri, dips into the longitudinal fissure. Also, you will note arachnoid granulations. These are little bump outs of the arachnoid, which contain one-way valves involved in the processing of cerebrospinal fluid. This slide shows dural sinuses. We already mentioned the superior sagittal sinus. In red, I have indicated the main dural extensions or partitions. Falx cerebri dips into the longitudinal fissure, separating and protecting the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. Tentorium cerebelli dips into the transverse fissure, separating and protecting the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Within the lower margin of the falx cerebri, there is the smaller inferior sagittal sinus, whereas at the roof of the tent would be the straight sinus. Ventricles are little bellies or spaces in the brain that contain CSF. Four ventricles include the two lateral ventricles. Each has three horns, anterior, posterior, and inferior. The two lateral ventricles drain CSF through their respective interventricular foramina into the third ventricle, which communicates with the fourth through the cerebral aqueduct. CSF is synthesized by the choroid plexus, blood vessels, and ependymal cells. Choroid plexus is found in all four ventricles. CSF then circulates through the brain and spinal cord and is released into the superior sagittal sinus. Here I have numbered the different areas through which a drop of CSF would flow through. If we start with the lateral ventricle, that drop will then enter into the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen, which then connects to the fourth ventricle via the cerebral aqueduct. From the fourth ventricle, CSF can enter into the spinal cord, but if it goes back into the subarachnoid space of the brain, eventually it's released into the superior sagittal sinus through those arachnoid granulations. Number 7. Remember, those have little one-way valves. Organization of the cerebrum from outside in. would be outer gray matter, cortex, middle white matter, and deeper lying basal nuclei, and that would be gray matter. So gray, white, gray. Each hemisphere has 5 lobes, frontal and parietal separated from each other by a central sulcus, temporal lobe located inferior to the lateral sulcus. Insula lobe lies deep within that lateral sulcus or fissure. Occipital lobe is located posteriorly. A little bit about basic functions, a little physiology. The precentral gyrus, lying in front of the central sulcus, is the primary motor cortex, voluntary movements. In front of that, the premotor cortex has to do with learned movements. Frontal eye field, eye movements, not vision. Vision is in the occipital lobe. Broca's area for speech, whereas Wernicke's area would be for the recognition of the spoken word. Prefrontal cortex, working memory, cognition, solving complex problems. Within the postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. What does that mean? It's responsible for perceiving skin senses, pain, pressure. Proprioception would be the perception of your body in 3-dimensional space. We cover that in the next chapter. Somatosensory association cortex identifies what is being felt. In other words, if you put your hand into your pocket and you're looking for your car keys, but you're feeling for the car keys, you will be able to pick up and identify the keys as opposed to perhaps coins. 2 other things we haven't mentioned yet would be auditory hearing centers, and gustatory or taste centers would be largely within the temporal lobe. White matter would include commissural fibers or tracts, again, myelinated axons. These connect one hemisphere to the other. The largest commissural set of fibers or tracts is the probably familiar to everybody, corpus callosum. Association fibers connect the cortex within the same hemisphere, whereas projection fibers connect cortical regions to other parts of the brain. Many of these projection fibers cross or decussate at the level of the medulla oblongata, forming the decussation of tracts. That means that for the most part, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. 3 parts of the diencephalon. Thalamus is the largest. It has 2 masses connected by an intermediate mass. The thalamus edits or processes and relays input, especially sensory incoming information, to the cortex. Epithalamus, with its pineal gland, produces melatonin, which aids in sleep. Hypothalamus, main visceral control center, including control of the autonomic nervous system, a lot of hormone or endocrine centers there too. Please note that extending from the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland or hypophysis, which, as you know from your studies of the skull, the pituitary gland resides within the hypophyseal fossa. Brainstem includes the midbrain, which is separated into 2 parts by the cerebral aqueduct. The dorsal portion contains 4 bumps corpora quadrigemina, 2 superior bumps, colliculi visual responses, 2 inferior colliculi for auditory responses. The cerebral peduncles are motor tracts. Pons, puente, bridge, serves to bridge different parts of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Medulla oblongata, the inferiormost part of the brainstem, is the site for the crossover or decussation of fibers. It also has crucial cardiac, vasomotor, blood pressure, and respiratory centers. Cerebellum, two parts on the outside. You have the leaf-like folia cerebelli, the gray leaves. Deep to it, the arbor vitae, or tree of life, and that would be white matter. Cerebellum serves to coordinate muscle movements, helps in balance or equilibrium, and posture. Spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum down to L1, L2, where it ends as the conus medullaris. The two enlargements, cervical and lumbar, give rise to the brachial and lumbosacral plexuses, respectively. Inferior to the conus medullaris would be the cauda equina, which would be a plexus or network of spinal nerves inferior to that conus medullaris. The filum terminale is an extension of pia that anchors the spinal cord inferiorly by attaching it to the coccyx. In purple on the right side, I have indicated the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which would be PNS and the subject of the next chapter. Spinal meninges would be continuations of cranial, dura, arachnoid, and pia. In addition to the subdural and subarachnoid spaces, in the spinal cord, there's an epidural space. That would be the site of injection of anesthetics when you are giving your patient an epidural. Spinal cord basics. Outer white matter, deeper gray matter, sort of in the form of a butterfly, central canal in the middle, containing CSF. The posterior indent is the posterior or dorsal median sulcus. In the front, the deeper indentation is the ventral or anterior median fissure. White matter is in the form of columns or funiculi. A funiculus is a rope. Very simple here, using directional terms, dorsal, lateral, and ventral columns or funiculi. Again, gray matter is sort of in the form of a butterfly. The crossbar on that butterfly is the gray commissure. In the center of it is the central canal with the CSF. The gray matter is further subdivided into horns, extensions known as horns. Again, using directional terms, those would be dorsal, lateral, and ventral horns. Finally, and in preparation to the next chapter on the PNS, let's define a spinal nerve. Extending from the dorsal region of the spinal cord is the sensory dorsal root. From the ventral portion would be the motor ventral root. They come together to form a mixed spinal nerve. Mixed would be sensory and motor components. The last structure to take note of in this slide would be the dorsal root ganglion, or the DRG. Remember, a ganglion is a cluster of neuron cell bodies. In this case, these are sensory neuron cell bodies, the DRG.